Okay. And it looks like my file's left, so I'll bring them right back. So again, thank you for joining us for this book chat on specifications grading, restoring rigor, motivating students, and saving faculty time. I hope in the true spirit of a book chat, everyone brought their coffee. I know I did. All right, I think I just want to dive in here. I'm curious to know a little bit about each of you. So if you can either pop on the microphone if you want to share that. I know there's about 7 of us in here, or you can just type away in the chat pod. Let me know your name, your department, and specifically what drew you to this particular book.
Folks may be typing things into the text chat, so I'll go ahead and turn my microphone on and tell you a little bit about why I wanted to join this session. So my name is Tracy Miller, and I work with Megan in the Center for Innovative Teaching and Learning. And what really drew me to this book discussion is it seems like a really innovative, creative way to think about grading, and some in ways that I hadn't thought about it before. So in this true spirit of we read the book so you didn't have to, I'm curious to find out more about this book.
Thanks, Tracy. Did anybody else read it? And I didn't expect you to. I just happened to have found out that in the past, we've actually had the author as a guest speaker at NIU, so I wasn't sure if anybody else had picked it up. Yes, yes, I'm looking at the chat here. As soon as you have multiple courses, it feels like grading takes over your life. I 100% agree. All right, so we are all in it to save time. I couldn't agree with you more. Okay, well, I guess I'll dive in a little bit and talk about my reaction to this book. So I actually was brand new to Linda Nilson's work. I didn't meet her, even though I know she's come to NIU in the past as a guest speaker. And when I looked at her book, I admit it, a little bit hesitant. I was a little bit skeptical about it. You know, just the title alone said restoring rigor. So, you know, it was obvious to me that she was addressing this perceived problem. We've lost rigor in our educational system. Maybe the other two are also problems in her mind. Our students might not be feeling very motivated. And now we're kind of spinning our wheels. So, you know, I wasn't necessarily opposed to this idea that she was addressing a problem, but I've seen a lot of articles and blogs and even books lately that point out the flaws in our education system, but their call to change is to do a complete overhaul of our educational system at the administrative level. And I think that can sometimes make instructors feel powerless. So I was pleasantly surprised by Linda's book that she kind of tackles this issue from the instructor perspective. She wants to give you back your, you know, your free time and also, you know, power within your classroom to make a change. So that was kind of my perspective. I went into it a little bit skeptical, but she definitely won me over. It was actually probably one of the best reads I've had in a while. So. And I did get this as a free ebook from NIU. So if you are interested in it, I do highly recommend, you know, checking it out from our library. Okay. So let's talk about this problem then, I think, so that I can tell you a little bit about specifications grading and, you know, where Linda's coming from. So I created a lovely little diagram here for you. She said that education right now is a game. Students win when they accrue the most points in the shortest amount of time. And she doesn't take this, you know, as a criticism of the students. It's a system that was created and they're reacting to it. And so she said the gamification nature of education leads students to very induced stressful environments, and they're also have kind of this misplaced emphasis on their grades rather than mastery of skill. So she included all sorts of facts about how students are now in record numbers seeking mental health counseling because their grades are stressing them out, which is actually kind of frightening. So this was my cycle that I kind of wanted to demonstrate for you, which she talks about extensively. But the stress starts with students who feel like they need to get a grade. So yes, I will be sharing this presentation with you. Absolutely. I'm recording it now, so I would be happy to send this with you. The stress, though, that she talked about is students have this focus on their grade. And that's true. I forgot to mention that my own background was when I was teaching. I'm not currently, but it was in English composition. So, when I kind of looked at this, I was like, okay, well, that makes sense. Before students can take English 102, they have to pass English 101. And they know they need a specific score. So if you say they need 70%, that's what their focus is on. So if you give your students a 68 or 69%, it's kind of guaranteed that they're going to show up in your office and they're going to want to haggle over those points. They're going to go through their latest assessment with a fine-tooth comb, and they're going to look for any place where they think that they can squeak back in a point or two. She also said that students might just go another route and they might ask for extra credit. Or her third example is that students might ask for partial credit. And again, she was talking, this is about that gamification nature of education. So a student might realize that, a 0 in the grade book is the worst possible thing that could happen. So they'll turn in something, and she calls it, her word, slop. And they know it's not anything good or that demonstrates their knowledge, but they're going to get some type of points. And they figure, well, even if I get a D or an F on this assignment, if I use my other points in the class to compensate for it, I'll still pass. So it's still more this gamification nature. So at no point are the students focused on mastering their skills. And all of this comes back to they need a certain GPA, right? They're worried about what goes down in writing, what's on their transcript. So they're thinking about what comes next. And again, it's a cycle. They're thinking about, can I get to my next class? Can I get to graduation? And then am I going to get to employment where I can get that pay scale that I always wanted? And so, of course, this is all right here and now. I need this grade to move forward. So, okay, that was kind of her cycle. I know it was a little bit quick. Any questions on that? Okay, all sounds quiet, so I'll move on. So this is where she said that specifications grading can really come into play. And I thought specifications grading was going to be this new innovative way of grading. And actually, she provides all this evidence that this is returning more to our historical roots of where higher education was first formed. So I knew kind of vaguely what specifications grading was. I knew it was competency-based, so it was either you know your material or you don't. But she said that it is focused on students meeting the outline learning objectives. And in order for this to work, it has to have two things. So you must have strong action-centered learning objectives, which I know could be a whole another book chat just all in itself. But then you also must provide a grading rubric when the assessment is handed to the students, when it's assigned. And at this point, I was kind of like, okay, but teachers are already using grading rubrics. I didn't understand what was so innovative about this. Her grading rubrics are what she calls a one-tier grading rubric. This is what you have to do to get the points. And it's very specific criteria. She does not believe in using vague language. So, if you have a word count, tell your students, how long does it need to be? If you're grading on mechanics, how many errors are permissible before they lose credit. So she has all sorts of this criteria, but all you do in your grading rubric is you tell them this is what you must do to get the points. So if it's a homework assignment and it's worth 10 points, you must do X, Y, and Z, and you get all 10 points. If you do not meet this criteria, you get 0 points. It's a pass-fail or meets expectations, does not meet expectations system. But she also believes in students practicing and learning and growing. So that means that she also is an advocate for revisions. And this was actually the part where she truly won me over. She said that if students do not pass, that first attempt, then somewhere along the line you have to give them a chance to revise. But revision means revising entirely, or they need to complete another assessment that meets the same learning outcome expectations. So, at this point I was starting to think about this, from my English major brain perspective. And I have a nephew who's 13 years old, and he does not like to write. So if he gets an essay back and somebody says, well, you need to expand in this area, his reaction to it is going back to that gamification model that I just showed you. He looks at it and he goes, oh, I need to expand. If I add 4 more sentences, am I going to get it? And that's not a revision. That, I would say, is more of an edit. So a revision would tell him that he needs to start the essay over completely from scratch. And if I don't think he's, going to do it, maybe just give him the same essay assignment, but with a brand new topic. And that kind of prompts the student to continue to hone, the writing skills, but they have to do it again from ground zero. Okay, so any questions on this so far? No, that was pretty fast. Okay. Well, I have some great. I have some discussion prompts because I'm curious to hear about how other people process this information and how do you apply it to your own field of study. So here is our chat question number 1. Linda Nilson argues that the specifications grading, this is how education was first formed. It's not new, it's not radical, it's actually just returning to the way that universities were first developed. So when you think about it in that context, this pass-fail system, we can still see it in areas of our education system currently. So I would like to know where you think you have observed the kind of this specifications grading or pass-fail system. And did you find it successful or unsuccessful? Great. So Nicole, I see your hand up. If you want to go ahead, you can turn on your microphone.
Yeah, hi. So I do entire courses pass-fail. And where I find there's a struggle is because I'm one part of a much larger program, students still fight for points. So if they don't meet the minimum expectation, I find that it's so ingrained in them to fight and argue and prove that they did meet the expectation, even though it's very clearly obvious that they did not. It's a real challenge when it's just one person in a department and not a whole mindset. At least has been my experience.
Yes, so this author does address that. She said, the first time that you switch to specifications grading, she calls it the millennial mentality, which, I tried not to flinch because I think technically I am a millennial. Or she alternates between calling it the millennial mentality and the customer service mentality. And she said that, yes, students, the first time that they get zeros, they will do exactly what you described. She said, yep, you just have to brace yourself for it. But if you institute some sort of a revision policy, and she has examples on how to insert that in your class, you can sort of relieve some of the pressure and take away some of that antagonistic attitude that comes with, I need these points to pass. So are you saying that it works, or it only half works?
Yeah, I mean, it works. So I do clinical education where our students are out in the clinic and they have to submit various assignments and they have to meet minimum thresholds. So that's why pass fail or satisfactory, unsatisfactory just really worked for this type of a course because it really isn't an overall grade. It's did you meet the minimum? So we find that it works. We just find that we still have students fighting for points and fighting to get that, passing grade on every single assignment, and arguing with us if they disagree with our grading. Because it's me and another colleague who grade this course. So I do think it works. I think it's a really great idea. It's just really hard with the mentality. So it's really trying to switch that student mentality. And the way we do it is we give them a buffer. So they have to submit, throughout a semester, they have to submit, say, 20 assignments, and they have to get a satisfactory or a minimum passing on all 20, on 80% of the 20 assignments, but they have to submit all 20. So it does give them a buffer because usually the first couple are where they get their unsatisfactory grades. And then they learn from those mistakes, and then moving forward, they don't make them again. So it shows that it does work in my mind. But I don't know. We just find that it's hard because it's just us doing it, and the rest of the program isn't. So they're still really, really grade focused and GPA focused and point focused.
That's great. I love that you talked about having that buffer, and letting them learn from their first few assignments. And she does talk about that too. So yeah, I think it is shocking when we've been brought up on a system where, okay, I didn't do great, but I can get, 6 or 7 out of the 10 points, and now you just get.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it is. You're trying to break a cycle that we've learned from
Yeah.
childhood.
And I hear it all the time in my other courses where I'm not doing satisfactory, unsatisfactory. Where they say, oh, I was doing really well in your course, so I didn't study for your final. The class bombs my final, average class grade of like 40%, something just ridiculously low that shows that they clearly didn't put time or effort into it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, well, I was really worried about this other class where I had to do better. Like, they totally pick and choose where they put their effort based on what do they have to do to get the minimum points to stay in the program. So I don't know how we change that overarching mindset, but I love the satisfactory, unsatisfactory, because you really have to demonstrate competency to move forward instead of just getting a minimum grade.
Great. I do too. And I see another chat in here as well. So an educator licensure, where they must pass all the requirements, and if they don't, they meet with a faculty member and redo sections not meeting expectations. Yeah, that's another example. Anyone want to expand on that or take it a different direction? Hi, Dan. Welcome. Go ahead.
Well, hi. How are you doing? Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and
Okay,
clear.
great. My concern is that when you have an expectation of meeting a minimum requirement, is that's what students will aim for. Says, well, I'll just do barely enough to get past or get by, instead of seeking a higher quality of mastery. Can you address that?
From Linda's perspective, yes. So when she sets the boundaries for her assignments, she doesn't set it as a minimum expectation. She sets it truly as somebody must have a solid understanding of the material being covered. Mm-hmm. She does have, and some people have taken it further, which she also addresses, that when she writes her rubrics, she will put, this is what you need to pass. And some people have taken it a step further, where if their students really exceeded expectations, then they got additional notation. So she had again, it was like a good and an excellent category. And her reasoning behind this is that there's nothing wrong with grades. There's nothing wrong with A, B, C, or D. Her rationale is that nobody knows what these categories mean anymore. So she's giving definitive expectations for each category more than anything else.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Sure.
I will add on to that, having done it, your rubric has to be incredibly in-depth. If you're doing just like, I don't even have points attached to these assignments for my SU courses. It's just you get an S or you get a U. And so the rubric is very in-depth as to what you need to get an S. And there can be many different categories. There can be like an S for grammar or spelling, an S for content, an S for writing, whatever. But it has to be very specific as to what you're actually looking for. It can't just be vague, which was mentioned kind of early on, to really give the students that guideline as to what is that expectation. So it's not a minimum. You know, like for satisfactory, mine can have no more than one spelling error. So I don't think that's unrealistic. I also don't think it's too easy. So you got to find that middle ground, I think.
Thank you, Nicole.
Dan, did you raise your hand again? Or...
I think that's Stephanie. I mean, Tracy.
Oh, okay. I don't know what happened. It just kept saying your name. Tracy, was that you?
Yeah, I just put it up. But I came up as number 2, so I don't know if
I don't know what I did. It was me.
I don't know what that means. I guess my example is I work with some faculty in the School of Nursing, and they do dosage tests where the students at a certain part of their program need to pass 2 dosage tests 100%. And like, I totally get that. I don't want a nursing student to move on unless they have dosages right. You know what I mean? So I think anything that is really skill-based but also critical would be, great examples of how to use this method.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned that. I used to work at a nursing college, and one of the things that I know with nurses is that at the end of their program, even if they pass, that doesn't mean that they are now a licensed nurse. They have to go and sit for the final examination. Much, I think, like for law school, same thing. They have to pass the board exam. And it's kind of the same thing. Either you pass that exam or you do not. I would argue that it works, but maybe not as well as it could. There's been a lot of criticism, even from the nursing community, that some of these exams, or almost all of these exams, are the standardized multiple choice tests. So if you think about that, think of a typical Scantron. You have a question and you have 4 possible answer choices. So even if you had no idea what the correct answer was, you have a 25% chance of getting it correct. So there's been a lot of criticism on these types of examinations and what do they really assess. So this is why Linda's all about trying to come up with a specific grading rubric that shows mastery of skill. And it sounds like she's saying, yes, you kind of have to front load your time. You're going to spend more time creating the rubrics, but once you have them, it's going to be very easy for you to go through your student submissions and determine if they've met this very specific criteria. Others? Do I think this system is better suited for one type of student than another? Level of motivation, self-direction, maturity. Anyone want to tackle that? It's a good question.
This is Dan. I think it might really also depend on the discipline. I agree, graduate versus undergraduate, because graduates are not novice students and may need not as much direction. But yeah, I think that there might be a case to be made for having maybe a particular kind of student. But the problem is that you don't necessarily have the same kind of student, all of the students in your class, and you can't really base it on the majority of the students, or even a small sampling of it. That's a great question though, Martin.
I teach in the graduate school, and I would argue that even teaching doctoral level students, they still need an unbelievable amount of guidance and instruction, and I don't find it much different than teaching in the undergraduate. And I do think that a lot of it is generational, because I've noticed a difference with our non-traditional students versus our traditional graduate students in the way that they learn and in their learning expectations. So I do think it's more generational versus level of education.
It's really interesting that you brought that up, Nicole. Linda Nilson actually addressed that. She said usually the students who are quickest to catch on to this gamification nature and the ones who really want to argue for points are the traditional students. In their mind, it's kind of like a linear progression. I'm going to do this, I'm going to get this grade, I'm going to get this many points, I'm going to go here. You know, it's like they're kind of climbing this ladder. And the non-traditional students usually don't approach it quite from that same angle, because they have more experience where they know that there's not a direct correlation between, you know, your GPA and your, well, your paycheck. I mean.
Yeah, that's sort of what I was thinking. Like a non-traditional student is likely to be a professional in some way, even if it's not the same, you know, the same discipline. And so they realize already that their, you know, their leadership within their corporation is not going to say, okay, you did that like 70% okay, so I'm going to let it go. You know, they're saying, no, it was wrong, do it again. So I could totally see that.
I completely agree. And I noticed it from the way that they approach asking questions to the way that they approach reviewing assignments and examinations to the way they send emails. You know, those students who've had professional experience to some capacity in more of like a full-time job, not, you know, part-time work somewhere, I do find that they approach graduate level schooling completely different than students that have not had that more or less real world experience, who more see it as I do A, then I do B, then I do C. I've even have had students of this, you know, millennial generation, of which I'm a millennial as well, who have had the audacity to say to me, well, I paid my tuition and I came to class, so I deserve an A. And I've had more than one student, I mean, I'm talking 10 to 15 students state that to me over the last 5 years. So there's really this mindset shift with this generation when it comes to schooling and when it comes to deserved grades or perceived effort. And I think that's where, for me, a minimum expectation rubric where it's blatantly clear you do this or you don't do this, and it's you need to do this to pass, has really helped me despite its challenges, because I do think that there's a generational shift, and we need to shift them away from point focus.
Seems like the system would help with the issue of capricious grading, maybe, possibly. Interestingly enough, since we're headed in this direction, I think I'm going to show you a couple of examples of what Linda came up with. She agreed that there is this customer service mentality that doesn't serve anybody well, though. Students will come out unprepared for the workforce. They're saying that the US, even though it's considered a super nation, as far as education goes, we are kind of losing ground compared to other nations. When they compare our graduates to other graduates from other nations, they have sharper skills. To the point now that when employers go to hire these recent graduates for that entry-level position, they don't know what they're looking at. The GPAs no longer really hold any kind of substance or meaning for them. So now they're asking for portfolios, or they're issuing a skills test, because that's the only way they know how to determine if somebody really has the skills that they need for this particular position. So Linda's reaction is that we need to try to shift them away, the students, from thinking that this is a customer service, that scenario where I've paid my tuition, now you're going to pass me, and to try to shift them into thinking of it like a client position, more like we're going to work together, you and I, and we're going to each contribute to this learning process. So again, she knows that instructors have their limitations. Certainly we have to submit grades, right? Even though we like this kind of pass-fail system, or maybe we're thinking about exploring it, ultimately you have to submit grades at the end of a semester. So she came up for a way to fit her specifications grading idea into the traditional grading system. I'm going to show you a couple of different examples. She has two that she actually came up with. We'll come back to that one. Okay, so one example is that you can set up your syllabus and give the cumulative point total. So I give an example, like you could say, okay, this course ultimately is comprised of about 1,000 points. And then of course you have to give the individual breakdown from there. How do they earn all of those 1,000 points? So 4 tests at 150 points each would be 600 points. So that's the bulk of their points right there. And then of course you would detail out where the other 400 are coming from. You can say that students receive full credit for each assessment if they satisfactorily meet the expectations outlined in the rubrics. Students receive 0 credit for an assessment if they do not meet the expectations, no partial credit, and then from there you give the grading scale. That was one option. I was like, okay, I'm like, that made sense to me. Does that sound reasonable, or does that make sense?
Megan, could you just clarify, the example you gave, individual assessment breakdown, 4 tests, 150 points each, and it may sound silly, but I just want clarification. They're still getting graded for however many points per test, right? Or is it they just get 150 points or 0 points?
Right, that's one example. She's saying you could do, then there's a couple different ways. I'm glad you asked. Yes, she says that you could do this. You could say that each test is worth 150 points. Now, either they get 150 points or they get 0 points. And you're right, that could cause some panic for students. If you implement a revision policy, that can alleviate some of that concern, which I'll get to next. But that's one example that she gave.
Thank you.
So it's interesting because even if it was the other way around, where the tests were more, you could get a certain percentage of those points, we're still talking about that being, a D with the 600 points. So you would really need to put in some effort to, and see, I'm adding up points again. I'm going right back to the old way of thinking.
So she has, and that's why she suggested you try her second approach,
okay,
which I'm going to show right here. Now, this, I was looking all over for an actual diagram that would show this approach, and she calls it the bundle approach. I call it choose your own adventure. And she didn't have a diagram of it, but somebody else did, which I thought was pretty accurate. So here is the choose your own adventure. So she tells you, you want an A, you're going to do this. You want a B, you're going to do this. This is what a C looks like, and this is what a D looks like. And you can tell that whoever this author was that came up with this diagram had switched it from, it looked like maybe like a 16-day course down to, or a 16-week course, pardon me, down to, a shorter course. And they're explaining, how you can adjust this for whether you're teaching an accelerated course or a traditional long semester. So I thought this was kind of interesting. This was somebody's take on Linda Nilson's specifications grading. I noticed in Linda's book that she didn't seem, at least the way she alluded to it, to like to calculate attendance into the grade. She prefers, the grade to solely be based on student performance in a course. But I imagine, and I could be wrong, but my understanding was she talked a lot about things like reflections and journal assignments. I imagine she would probably have one of these daily activities in each of her course. And that in its own way would substitute for taking attendance. You know, if you didn't have all of your journal reflections completed, it would be obvious that you had not been attending class. So that was kind of my take on her way of avoiding calculating attendance into the grade. And there is actually, I had to read this to you. So there's a foreword in her book from another, so a super rubric, yes. Yes, that's exactly what it is. There's a foreword in her book from another instructor that I thought was very clear on what Linda Nilson is aiming to do. So I'll read this to you very quickly. It's just a couple of sentences. And she says, specifications grading addresses a question that has long puzzled faculty. Why aren't the grades earned by students accepted as assessments of student learning? Traditional grades don't work as assessments of student learning outcomes because they merge multiple sources of information about student skill into a single composite score. Factors unrelated to student learning outcomes might contribute to determination of a final grade. For example, instructors may reduce a grade if a student submits a project after the due date, or lower a student's class grade if the student accumulates too many unexcused absences from class. Similarly, students might improve a grade by completing extra credit assignments or engaging in volunteer activities, although these activities might not align well with the course's learning outcomes. When extraneous variables contribute to how instructors determine a grade, or when instructors combine performance assessments across multiple learning outcomes to create a single composite grade, the diagnostic information about student strengths and weaknesses on specific learning outcomes is lost. So I just thought that was a kind of an interesting summary of what she's attempting to tackle here.
I think that's really interesting. I think, yeah, I second the wow that Tracy Miller wrote down. I find that to be really interesting. And in my courses that I don't do SU, I've established, because exams and we always, students are point focused, something that I've implemented because I don't find it acceptable for a student to take, except for the final, but for mid-semester exams, to not take them seriously and just say, oh, I'll do well on the final. So what I do is, if the exam is 100 points and you get an 80, then for any points that you miss, you are expected as an assignment for the course to go back through those questions and you have to fill out a test autopsy. So for each question that you missed, you have to state what was your answer and the rationale for your answer, what was the right answer and the rationale for the right answer, and what did you learn. So is it, a processing error? Did you read the question wrong? Did you not know that content area? And you have to fill out this test autopsy for every single question that you miss. And it takes a very long time to do. So students don't want to get a 60% on the exam and have to do 40% of their grade via test autopsy. And I do end up giving them points back for doing it. They get 25 to 50% of a point back for each question. It's a way to, bring students back to, it's not acceptable to not know the material at a minimum level. So I love the test autopsy. I think it's wonderful.
I'd never heard of a test autopsy, but I really want to add that to my vocabulary. So I'm going to try to insert that in conversation today.
Oh my goodness, yeah. You can look them up. There's different worksheets and stuff out there for test autopsies, because a student just might not perform well on a test one day. They had a life event going on, and then they go back and they do the test autopsy, and they learn through doing the test autopsy. So I think it's a valuable, and it's an assignment for the course. That's why they get some of their test points back for doing it. But it's a really valuable learning tool if you're not switching to a completely SU course. It's a great way to assure that students are demonstrating that they know the material.
Yes. I have one other slide that I wanted to show you, and then I want to bounce back to some of these discussion questions because I'm loving what people are telling me about their courses here too. So let me. Here's something that I thought was interesting. Oh, I didn't check on that. Sorry, there's a token in the middle of my slide there. So Linda also took on this idea that, well, gamification is not bad inherently. We've taken it maybe too far in the way that our students are graded. So she's like, there's a way that you can add it back in strategically to your course, and you want to use it maybe for revisions. And so she introduced this idea of what she calls tokens. And she likes this idea of revisions because that's truly where the learning takes place. If somebody is struggling to understand their content, she says you have this one-tier grading rubric. This is what you need to do to pass. And if they don't meet those expectations, students are going to be more likely to focus on your comments because they need to process that information and revise. And she doesn't want to penalize students for revising. This idea is that they're learning and they're practicing and they're doing it again. So she gives out these tokens to her students, and the students know what the tokens represent because it's very clearly outlined in the syllabus, but it could stand for things like maybe they need an extension. So they get 24 hours extra on one assignment. Or one of the tokens is they can redo a major assessment. So whether that's a test, a lab, an essay, something like that. So you need to include specific criteria, like what can they use the tokens for, what do they stand for, and how can they, apply them. So, and then she said, if you have students who are excelling in the class and don't need to use their tokens, she was like, let them, turn in their tokens for a prize. And that prize should not be affiliated with their course grade whatsoever. So I swear I remember reading in her book for a poetry class, students who had all their tokens left at the end of the course could win a free book of poetry. That type of a thing. But she really stresses this idea that there needs to be areas in your course where students can revise, maybe not everything, because that is going to increase your grading workload, and they would take advantage of numerous revisions they would never try on their first attempt. So she's like, use the tokens, determine the amount that's appropriate for your course, and make sure that you're strategic about it, but fair. And then, she also says, like, let it just, if they pass on the second attempt, just replace the score. At that point, they've proven that they've mastered the skill. I think, when we focus too heavily on points instead of skills, that's where, a lot of times, it's like you're splitting hairs and you would try to merge those two test scores together. I think probably all of us have witnessed that at some point. Like, I'll average your two test scores together. And she thinks that's not necessary. Okay. So let me jump back to some of these chat questions. Since we bounced around, I kind of moved with it. So here's one of the questions that I had for everyone is, what do you consider to be the most difficult aspect of grading? And how do you measure an adequate amount of time spent on grading? So you could answer one or both, or
for that because it's a weekly quiz, and then there is a midterm which has a certain value too. And sometimes I look at the what is it, the report, the test item analysis, to determine if in fact a question is just too easy or it's too hard, and then having to make a decision as to how to revise that question so that it's more fair for the student. It actually is truly assessing what it should be without being too onerous. So it's just the fact of having to go back and revising and relooking at my assessments, even for assessments that I've used for a few years. That's challenging.
Okay. I see lots of comments here. This is good. It is challenging, and you have to, and you question yourself, don't you?
Absolutely, I do question myself.
Linda, only one glass of wine before grading Spanish compositions. Okay. That's fair. Depends on the course, consistency, fairness. A really good rubric takes a good deal of time. Linda Nilson's argument is that if you have a really strong rubric that outlines very specific pieces of the assignment, that you'll be able to clearly identify them, and it takes less time. I know I've worked with somebody who had a strict policy that they would set an egg timer. This was one of my old colleagues, and she made sure that everybody received the same amount of time for grading. Unless, of course, maybe a student turned in something that was only partially completed and didn't take the same amount of time. But I think it was like, 5 minutes per assignment. I don't know if that's right or wrong, but I'd say it's consistent. I mean, most difficult part is trying to balance grading with other responsibilities, but the grading always takes precedence. Martin's worried about whether grades align with proficiency. Yes.
And
So
Nicole, if I may chime in on that
yes, please do.
point, you had said something in passing that you're saying we no longer know what these grades mean or say. What's an A? What's a B? When you give a student, well, not give. I tell my students I don't give them grades; they earn them. Say if a student ends up with a C from my class, what does that mean? So that is always a concern of mine when I'm grading. What am I communicating?
Would you ever consider like one of those bundle packages that she talked about? This is an A, this is a B, this is a C?
Absolutely not, because that will be inviting students to use a word that I'm hearing more often these days, confused, where they say, I don't understand what this is, because it's something new. That's number one. Number two, I think this would be a very good effort if it was adopted, let's say, across a department or a discipline, so that students have that consistency of, what they're seeing in terms of their grades. But if I'm just doing it in my class and they're not seeing it in other classes, then they will think that, there's something that I'm doing that's very different. Of course, this is a conversation that I'll be happy to advance with my colleagues to see if other people would do it, because I agree, if it's done across the board, it's good. If I'm doing it alone, then I think it will cause confusion.
I understand. Yeah, there's something to be said about that. Anytime somebody, perceives a new way of grading, then, change is scary. They're more likely to pick on the one person who stands up and makes the change. All right. If we have enough time, I would love to tell you the history of this or summarize it, but I did have one last chat question for everybody. So if you think about your own course, what areas in your course, or just a single area, do you think could be more rigorous? And how would you change it? I know for myself, I'll just respond since I was an English instructor. I realize now that a lot of times when I allowed my students to revise, they would only revise just a couple areas of their essay. And the thing is, as an instructor, I never wanted to mark all over their paper. Um, you know, the words on their page should be their words, not the red ink. But when I would mark in the columns or, you know, the margins about something that I had observed, it was usually a trend that carried throughout their paper. You know, there was an opportunity for them to really address and change a certain aspect of their writing. Unfortunately, when they revised, it was just they would only address the areas where they saw the red ink. So, you know, I think after having read Linda's book, probably a smarter revision strategy to really encourage them to keep writing and to keep building those skills was to ask them to do a rewrite on a completely different topic.
Or deficient at. I will also recommend that they look at one of their colleagues, because this is the discussion board. Everyone has an equal opportunity to see anybody else's posting. Is that they say, well, you know, you should look at so-and-so's for a better example of what we mean by being more comprehensive or detail-oriented, whatever. And I will make that suggestion, and I just hope that they would do that. And maybe from week to week they don't do that, and they're getting the same type of responses, weak responses, and I don't really think they're actually looking at the examples that I recommend. To make it more rigorous, I don't know, maybe I would require them to do that and maybe have some sort of response to how their posting is not the same as the other person's. I'm not sure how I would do that. Um, uh, but you know, I guess what it is try to encourage them more to look at that fellow students posting, to give them a better idea of how to respond. And if you make the suggestion and they don't do it, you know, I don't know what more to do then.
Could you give them maybe like a writing topic where they have to compare their post to another post to discern differences?
That's a possibility, but like you had suggested earlier, that's a bit more work, especially if it's multiple people in the class. So it's challenging enough to grade 25 to 30 students every week, and some of the posts can be very involved. So adding a little bit more, it might be worth it, as long as it's a manageable number of students that are doing that.
Jennifer suggests maybe having students give other students feedback on parts of their paper. That could be interesting.
It's like kind of sort of a peer assessment where the students are actually providing their own input. I mean, I can see the value of that.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I do.
Go ahead.
I was saying, yeah, hi everybody. Yeah, I do have students give some feedback on like their final presentations at the end of the semester, and I like grade the initial part of the paper before they, you know, develop the entire paper. But I don't have students like read each other's papers or, you know, or parts of it or something. But that's just something came to mind.
Thanks, Jennifer.
It's an interesting idea. Linda Nilson has a whole section in this book devoted to this idea that if they're in group projects, that they also have to do group assessments. It really keeps them on track if students are concerned that they'll get 0 points because they're their group members felt they didn't contribute. She finds it very easy for students just to work together as a group and to make sure that everyone contributes. So kind of an interesting aspect.
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah.
I know we're down to the last couple of minutes, but just as something that I thought was kind of interesting was Linda Nilson actually gave a history of how higher education was formed. Allow me to rephrase that. So the first universities were actually developed in Europe, and at this time it was just the great minds were coming together. They were preparing lesson plan material, and their students either understood the material or they did not. There was no type of, formal assessment, no progress reports, no grades of any sort. And these grades actually didn't even appear until about, they said, 3 centuries ago, the contemporary grading system that we have now. The first type of grade that ever came about was as more and more students flocked to these universities, they implemented a competition. And the competition was, after all of these students had spent all this time studying together, they now competed to demonstrate their skills in various areas. And those who finished in the top tier, they were given all sorts of accolades. They were given recognitions, and the very top winner of this competition was also given a monetary reward for the rest of his life. So when the universities came over to the US, our university system is not based on how the universities were first formed, where it was just the great minds, mentoring the students. Our university system is actually based on that competition. So an A was the winner of the competition. The Bs were those who still, scored very well and received recognition, and so on. From there, it turned into, it was one of the, oh gosh, I was an instructor at one of the Ivy League colleges. I'll have to look it up specifically. Began adding pluses and minuses, and then it carried over where each instructor had a different definition of an A, B, a C, or a D, and it varied from institution to institution, from instructor to instructor. And that was actually how our current grading system was formed, which I just found fascinating. Did anyone else know that? Because I sure didn't.
Yeah, I'm completely illuminated. I did not know that at all.
They were called, I think the competition was called the Tripos. So this was the start of categorizing scores. The students were competing amongst themselves. So I just thought this was kind of interesting. Like when we talk about specifications grading and doing, pass or fail, do you know your material or do you not know your material? That was actually the origins of higher education. The grading scale that we have now is actually the new and inventive twist. So that was all that I had prepared. I actually really enjoyed this book. I didn't think I would. It's probably my favorite book that I've read on pedagogy in a while. So I recommend it. I wouldn't say that if I didn't mean it, but other than that, if you are interested in learning more about Linda Nilson, which you may already know, she's an author of multiple books. She is the founding director of the Office of Teaching Effectiveness and Innovation at Clemson University, and she's had this title for over 25 years. And her background is in sociology. So I'll leave this up, and feel free to send me a message if there's any questions I can try to answer about her book. Thank you for joining me.
Linda's at my old alma mater, UCLA.
Yes.
Very cool.
I would love to know more about her perceptions on disaster behavior since the pandemic.
Yes, I think that's a great question.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. I am recording this, so I'll be sure to send links to the recording.
Thanks, Megan.
Thank you.